Hi, I'm Heather Telford. Welcome back to my channel. I'm showing you a video today where I use alcohol inks, my gel plate and a stencil to create these three panels. Recently I shared a card on my blog using this technique. It was a different stencil, slightly different colors, but this is the technique I used. And the beauty of this technique is one application of alcohol ink gives you a bold image, a slightly more subtle image, an even more subtle image, and you could go on as long as there is ink left on your stencil. So let's take a look at the process. I'm doing some alcohol inks on the gel plate, and I'm going to show you several different ways to do it, and they all work, they just give slightly different effects. So I'm adding a little bit of alcohol ink, then I'm going to, probably more than I need, but we'll see. This is rubbing alcohol. I have it in a fine tip bottle, fine tip applicator, because then I can put out just as much as I need. I'm going to move that around a little bit. I've just got two colors, but I don't want them to become one color with too much mixing. So I've just moved them a little bit. And I'm going to lay my stencil on top. You can see from the color, there's a little bit of color on this stencil. I did get started before you arrived, and you can possibly see by the splatter all around that I've done a few test runs before I started filming. So what is happening here is I've got my Lavinia stencil. It's called Coral. And I've laid it down, and it's clinging because the gel plate is a little sticky, and of course there's liquid on there. But this is going to take a long time to dry if I just wait for it to air dry. So I'm just gently moving some of this around because I've got plenty of alcohol ink, and this was rubbing alcohol, it wasn't blending solution. I've got plenty on there, so I'm just gently kind of spreading it. If I go too hard, it will splatter off right off my paper, which isn't the end of the world. You can see my paper's getting quite pretty there, but I'm trying to be a little bit gentle. Yeah, you saw that one. There's a lot of liquid there, so right over even onto my clean paper sitting on the side ready to take a print. So I'll just be a little more gentle with this, but I do want to get coverage in as many places as possible. Now, if you wanted it everywhere, then you could add a little bit more color or a little bit more blending solution to just move it. Let me try and get it a little further down here. But I'm going to make a card front out of this panel, so I don't really need it to cover the whole 5x7. This way I can just take my print and then choose the bit that I like best for my card front. You can probably see that there is still liquid moving around. So that's one way I'm still drying. That's one reason I'm still drying it. But the other thing you can see, if you put the blower, and you could use this kind of blower, or if you've got a electric blower, you could use that. But as you point at parts of the stencil, sometimes the ink emerges from underneath these strips because it does kind of cling under there. So you want to move that too, because otherwise, if I lifted that stencil up now, because there was liquid underneath, it would continue to move, because that's what alcohol ink does. It continues to move. So that's why I am doing so much drying. The other way to get this dry would be using the tool called Patience. And you could just set it aside and go and do something else and come back later. And often I do just lift this up, move it along, maybe work on something else. I think this is dry now. I gave it some more drying time off camera. And I'm going to lift this up because it'll need, even after I lift this up, it might need a little more drying time even then. I'm not going to wash this straight away because it still has some nice ink on it, and we'll use it again. So even once the stencil is off, there could be a few wet areas of ink right under where the stencil was clinging to the ink and to the gel plate. So another few bursts, and ideally just another few minutes letting it sit. I chose this particular stencil because of all these fine lines on it. I find that this technique works really well with the fine lines. If you have thicker lines, then more liquid will pool underneath, or pool underneath, and it'll take even longer to dry. Now that this is totally dry, I'm going to lift this with paint. So even though up until now it's all been alcohol ink, I'm going to use paint to lift it. I usually lift a design with a light color. I'm going to use white this time. So a little bit of acrylic paint. And it really doesn't need much. And you may find as you cover the gel plate with acrylic paint and roll some off, you may find that you're getting the color of the alcohol inks. That just means they didn't dry totally. So I'm getting a little bit of green there, but that's okay. If I had done it when they were really wet, then I would have blurred the print with the brayer. I don't want to do that, but I'm still going to get a distinct print here. As you can see, I wanted a really thin layer of paint. I'm going to lay down my printer paper. You could use cardstock if you wanted to. And you can see there just how distinct that color is from the alcohol ink. That's a first print. Let's do a second print because, as I mentioned, there is still alcohol ink on the stencil. So I can have a look and see. Looks like there's more color on this side, but it really doesn't matter which way I do it. So I'm going to, well, there are two orders of operation here. I'm just going to lay this down first and get it to start clinging. And then I'm going to add rubbing alcohol. And my aim is to get that ink, and you can see it start to move already, off the stencil and back onto the gel plate. You can help it along a little bit in two ways. You could kind of push it off with the air pump. That's one way to do it, and we'll probably do a bit more of that. The other thing you can do is put some gloves on, or not if you want to, just get your fingers dirty and push it off with your fingers. What I will do here though is I don't want to lose the fact that I've got green in some areas and blue in others, so I'm just going to swap fingers as I move some of that ink. Now that's still quite wet. There's still alcohol ink pooling on top of the stencil. So I'm going to switch back to the blower. Now remember, I didn't add any new ink, any new alcohol ink. I just diluted what was left on the stencil with rubbing alcohol. I've given that more drying time while I wasn't filming, and now I'm going to lift it off and then give it even a little more drying time in case there are still wet areas that were sitting underneath the stencil. And you can see there's still ink on the stencil, so you can do this again. I gave it a little more drying time, and now I'm going to pick it up once again with white paint. I'm just keeping the colors the same so that I can show you the difference between that first print I picked up and the second one. I also like the idea that I'm getting 2 prints or 3 or 4, depending on how long I keep doing this, from the one application of alcohol ink. So that's print number 2. That's print number 1. So you can see more diluted colors, a little softer. And you could even do print number 3. Let that dry for a while. Softer again. Let's look at the 3 prints. First one, most intense ink. Second one, leftover ink. Third one, still with leftover ink.